Hey everybody, this is Timothy here. I am going to go ahead and record a video as kind of a follow-up to playing Eternal Masters. First thing I want to do is shout out everybody who watched the archetype videos I made, the 5-part series, kind of walking through the 10 different color combinations in Eternal Masters. I got a lot of very positive feedback, and a lot of people told me it was helpful, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to watch those videos, and any kind of feedback you gave me was very, very helpful. I hope it was helpful for anybody who didn't comment while drafting Eternal Masters, and I really hope people got out to play this set while it was in stock, and hopefully if you haven't, your local game store still has a little bit of a product left for you to play before it vanishes from shelves. But at any rate, I'm gonna go ahead and follow up with my personal draft experience. I did 3 separate drafts, and little note at the bottom here, I'm kind of biased on the things I'll say in this video, so keep that in mind from the get-go. I actually drafted the same archetype with all 3 drafts, not because I was forcing it, but that's what was open all 3 times, and it did some work. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to show you the deck that I played during the very first draft. Now, I played red-white in all 3 drafts, just solid red-white deck, not splashing for anything, and it was quite good. This is the deck that I put together. And it brought me to a 2nd place finish at F&M on Friday. So you'll notice it's just, it's not a straight out aggressive low curve deck. It has a lot of 4-drops and even a couple 6-drops, counting Pyrokinesis as a 6-drop. It's not the ideal build. I'll show you the sideboard here in a second, but it was enough to push in quite a bit of damage. You'll notice the double Flamekin Zealot and the Goblin Trenches were really payoffs for being in this color combination. I think what I did well was while drafting, I managed to identify that red-white was open. Having get past like a 7th or 8th pick Flamekin Zealot in the first pack, I decided to take it and see if red-white really worked out. And then I got rewarded by being past a Goblin Trenches in the 2nd pack, and I was able to even wheel a 2nd Flamekin Zealot in the 3rd pack. Also picking up some really strong cards along the way, like Giant Solifuge and Duplicant. Plus a bunch of low-curve creatures. Now, when you see the sideboard, I'll kind of talk about a couple of the decisions I wish I had made to make it even a little bit better, but this did bring me to 2nd place, so it was quite good. Not ideal, not as good as my 2nd or 3rd draft, but good enough to get me a 2nd place finish. So you'll also notice there's a high mountain count and a low plains count. I had originally started with kind of an equal build, equal red and equal white, but I decided to lean more towards red, mainly because of the 4-drops, all of the double red 4-drops, but I could have very easily, I think, shifted into kind of an equal color deck with red-white. So looking at the sideboard, these are the notable cards I had. Anything else that was off color, I just kind of left off in the first place. I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of the cards and why I chose not to include them and what I wish I had included. First off, Milliken, not a very good card in this type of deck. Ramping into a 4-drop is good, but I figured it wasn't really worth my time to include it. I wanted to be super aggressive. I didn't want to take a turn off to put this low impact creature on board. Desperate Ravens was a card I was unimpressed with, not having the ability to flash it back. I did eventually play 2 Desperate Ravens in my 3rd draft, and they were okay, but I was never super impressed with them. Second Thoughts was an okay removal spell against kind of bigger creature decks, and it really helped me push the edge against an Armadillo Cloak deck, just removing that creature off the battlefield and mitigating the life gain that they were using. Hookmaster is one card that I wish I had just included in my main deck. I had 1 copy in, but I think the 2nd copy would have been great. This is probably one of the best white commons in the set, especially if you're playing this exact color combination, red-white. It locks down a creature. It doesn't come in tapped, so it gets to, block if necessary, and it just lets you push in a lot of damage. The other card I really wish I had included in the main deck is Calciderm. This card is absolutely absurd, and I had no idea how to evaluate it, because Vanish in 4 is kind of a little bit of a put-off, but the card is so powerful. Just it gets to attack 3 times as a 5-power creature. The turn it comes down, it probably shuts your opponent off from attacking, and it just does so much work in that 3 turns. So I wish Calciderm was actually in my main deck. If you haven't played with or against this card, I suggest taking it as soon as you can and trying it out, because it's absolutely absurd. White Mane Lions, you'll notice if you look back at the other deck that I had a couple of Echo and Vanishing creatures, and I think White Mane Lion would have been quite good to work with those. especially the Keldon Marauders. But in the end, I decided white mainline is not what I wanted to go with, even though I think it would have been an okay inclusion. Glimmerpoint Stag was cut mostly for the double white. And just being another 4-drop, I felt the other 4-drops were more impactful in the deck. But I do like Glimmerpoint Stag. It's kind of a pet card of mine in Commander, and I think it would have been fine to include it. Flame Jab, we were kind of debating whether or not this is the type of card you include in your main deck or not, and the thing that really cut me off of playing it was the fact that I had Goblin Trenches, so I didn't want to be discarding my lands. I wanted to be playing them and turning them into tokens. So I eventually cut Flame Jab. My inclination is that you wouldn't want to include Flame Jab in your main deck. You would keep it in your sideboard against 1 toughness creatures or a mass of tokens on your opponent's side of the field. But I'll leave that to your discretion. Wildfire Embassy I found very underwhelming, even in the matchups where my opponent was playing white. I just didn't like the card. I thought it was low impact. Sting Scourger, diminishing returns on that card. I had 2 of them already. I didn't want to pay the echo cost very often, so I definitely didn't want to play a 3rd one. Dragon Egg is geared more towards red-black than any other combination. It is not the card you include in an aggressive red deck, so that was an easy cut. And the Swiftwater Cliffs I left out because I wasn't playing the Desperate Ravens. There was one match where I boarded in a Cliffs plus a Desperate Ravens, but that was more because I was taking cards out that were bad in the matchup rather than putting cards in that were good. So yeah, there's sideboard here. Like I said, the Hookmaster, very, very good card, and Calciderm is absolutely absurd. Other than that, I was fine with my build. What I would have taken out, not quite sure, but if you look back at the deck, maybe Young Pyromancer was not the best in here with only, 3 or 4 spells. Duplicant, I'll talk about later on in this video, I did not like at all. And Orcish Oriflame I don't think was necessary with the double Flamekin Zealot. Even Dual Caster Mage could have come out, maybe even Pilgrim's Eye. But I think the build was fine, and 2nd place finish is enough for me to be satisfied with it. Just to kind of point out what kind of won the day or won the couple of drafts, and I noticed this was consistent across all 3 of the drafts that I did. Even if I didn't get 1st or 2nd place, one of these 3 decks did. Red-White Tokens was very strong, and I'm kind of biased because I did play it 3 times, but it seemed incredibly strong. I kept getting pushed into it by the cards that were passed to me, and it performed very, very well against a bunch of different archetypes. Red-green seemed to be the most popular beatdown, with people taking Kurt Apes absurdly early in a draft, along with Flinthoof Boar and other hasty beatdown creatures. It was very strong. Cards like Rancor really pushed it over the top, and there's just a mass of hasty creatures in this set that you can really beat your opponent down if they're not prepared for it. In my first draft at F&M, I played against 3 red-green decks back-to-back, which is absolutely crazy. 2 of which were in the same pod with me drafting red as well. So the colors are really deep here, but red-green is super strong. And then 1st place, shout out to my other buddy Tim, who actually won our F&M draft with Blue-White Flyers. I think Blue-White Flyers, as I guessed, is a very good combination to go in. If you draft a couple early game blockers and walls, say like Glacial Wall or Wall of Omens, and you just get in the air with these creatures, you can really take to the skies and, bash your opponent down before they can come up with a game plan. It's really hard to interact with the Flyers without removal spells, and there's only 2 creatures in this set that have reach, and they're concentrated in one color, so if you're not playing green, you're going to have trouble dealing with these cards in the first place. So definite shout out to anybody who played Blue-White Flyers. I think it might be the best deck next to red-green or red-white. These 3 are, in my opinion, the best decks, and I'm biased. I didn't play a lot of different varied decks, but I did watch a lot of games, and I'm pretty confident that I'm willing to say that some combination of these colors is going to pull you up into at least the top 4 most of the time. What did not work, Threshold decks. I don't know what it is about Nimble Mongoose. Maybe it's just because it does get played in Legacy, but Nimble Mongoose is not a good card in Draft. I didn't think it was going in, and I kind of confirmed that coming out. How much work do you really want to do to make a 3/3? Unless you're going really, really hard in the strategy, and you're willing to turn on Threshold with cards like, I don't even know what it is, the Mill 3 card, or Silent Scab, or whatever the cards are called, like self-mill cards. Unless you're really devoted to self-mill, then Nimble Mongoose and other Threshold cards just aren't that great. They're very low impact when they come down, and they don't get that much better when you have Threshold. The only card that kind of stands out to me is Werebear, and that's more because it's a mana dork than it is a creature that gets bigger later on. I played against a lot of decks with Nimble Mongooses and Werebears, and the Nimble Mongooses always fell short. Even when they became 3/3s, they were very low impact at that point. Green-Black Elves, I think, was a really cool strategy that too many people were trying to draft at once. The problem with it is that most of the Green Elves are cards you would play in a green deck in general, like Llanowar Elves. Same goes for a lot of the Black Elves, like Blight Soil, or whatever the card's name is. The one that taps for green mana, pay a life. You would play those in most of your just green and black decks in general, so being rewarded for elves was very difficult, I think. Also, cards like Imperious Perfect are just self-contained engines, and people would pick up things like Heritage Druid just for the money. So it was very hard to draft a green-black elf deck that had a lot of payoff. In my third draft, we actually had 3 people fighting at the table for it. You need to get a lot of payoff cards to make it work. Shaman of the Pack, Wirewood Symbiote, and a good number of other elves, and I just don't think it's there. And even when it does pan out, I don't think it's the best strategy. And then looking back over the set, I noticed in general that I don't think black was a very good color. The kind of strategies it works with didn't seem to pan out very well. Reanimator was focused more in blue for some reason, with a couple of cards being in black. The Sacrifice deck I didn't get to see a lot of, but it didn't seem particularly great against decks that had a lot of tokens. I played against one deck that had a Prow and Pangolin, but I ended up trading my Raise the Alarms for a Pangolin, like my 2-drop for their 5-drop. That didn't seem great, and even a card like Innocent Blood seems terrible against certain matchups, so I'm not sure. I never really saw a reason to move into black. My rares didn't push me there, and I passed most of the black rares I saw in the first place. So if you had success with black, let me know what you were playing. Was it black-blue, black-red, whatever? Black-white seems like it could be okay, but again, if you watched my archetype videos, I don't think that was a very fleshed-out strategy in the first place. I would avoid black going into most drafts. Couple quick tips that I'd like to share in case you haven't done one of these drafts or you plan on doing a couple others, if that's a possibility for you. Maybe you bought a box, maybe you're willing to draft with your friends. First off, be prepared for aggressive decks. They're a huge part of this format, and maybe it's a little presumptuous to say that after just 3 drafts, but I not only played very aggressive decks, but I played against them really well. There are a lot of haste creatures. They are very powerful cards that add a lot of power to the board and deal a lot of damage. You need to be prepared with either small board wipes, or even a card like Giant Tortoise can do the trick against a lot of borderland marauders and things like that. Just big toughness creatures that are going to hold off the field long enough for you to get going with what you're doing. If you're not playing the aggressive deck, you need to have a plan to beat them, because I guarantee no matter where you're drafting or what colors you're in, at least a couple people at the table will be playing some super strong aggressive deck. Be prepared for it, or be prepared to lose for it. I also noticed these super conditional setup cards, these cards that work in certain strategies but don't really affect the board right away, are not really doing much. You want to constantly be affecting the board, I think, putting out creatures and so on and so forth, or at least enchantments that affect the board. Cards like Commune with Gods, Dream Twist, Quiet Speculation, these kind of setup cards that work towards a strategy, they just weren't cutting it for me. And again, the bias comes up here. I was playing an aggressive deck, so anytime my opponent took a turn off to play a card like this, that just let me get in an extra 3, 4, 5 damage, and it just didn't pay out for the opponent. Sure, they get a card up or they're setting up their strategy, but if you're taking up too much damage in the meantime, it's not going to work out well. The gold cards are very, very clear signals in this set. Flamekin Zealot came around every single draft. I played at least 2 in all 3 of my drafts, and I actually got a 3rd one in my 3rd draft, which is absurd. Red-white is strong, and if you see this card coming around, it means red-white is probably open. Same goes for cards like Shaman of the Pack, Thunderclap Wyvern. If you see those cards mid to late pack, it's a good bet that if you're in the first pack, you might be able to pick them up and draft that strategy and have a good, consistent deck. These are highly sought-after cards for their own individual decks, so having them open means that that deck is probably open. One quick note on that, just because you see a good red-white card does not mean that red is open. and it does not mean that white is open, but it often means that the combination of red and white is open, which sounds weird to a couple people who haven't drafted a lot, but you can have a person to your left drafting red and a person to your right drafting white, but that doesn't necessarily mean anybody's drafting red-white, so you can get rewarded with the payoff cards like this, Goblin Trenches, so on and so forth. Just a good example of what to watch out for if you're trying to figure out what decks are open. Another thing I noticed, especially playing this color combination, the mechanics Vanishing and Echo have a real drawback to them, and you can't afford to draft that many of the cards. Excuse me. Sorry. Avon Rich did. Out of all 4 of these cards here, none of them are unplayable. In fact, they're all very good cards. But the fact is, if I was jamming all 4 of these in one deck, I might actually lose to taking up too many of my own turns. Just losing cards, or my creatures sacrificing themselves after a certain number of turns. Echo cards usually come down and have a very strong effect, but a lot of times you're not incentivized to pay the echo cost, or if you do, you're basically time walking yourself for a 2/2 creature or something along the lines. Vanishing creatures are a little bit better because they tend to have higher toughness and power. They tend to have a higher impact over the course of a couple turns. But I noticed when my opponent was playing cards like this against me, I would often just hold back my removal spells, block a couple times, and then the creature would take care of itself after a couple turns, and that would put me ahead even though they got an advantage when they played the card. It is a form of card disadvantage. Thankfully, these cards are strong enough that they mitigate their own abilities, or usually make up for it, especially a card like Calciderm, which just beats down over the course of a couple turns. But you can't afford to make a deck that just jams too many of these. I played about 4 or 5 Echo cards in my first draft, and I think that was a little bit too much. There are a lot of times I couldn't afford to pay the Echo cost, either because I was behind or I needed to add something else to the board. So keep that in mind when you're drafting a color combination like this. And then the final 2 tips I'll say, draft sideboard cards. There's a lot of speculation. These 2 things kind of go hand in hand, so I'll mention 6 here is don't prioritize the dual lands. Try to stick to a 2-color combination. Don't try to be fancy with 3-color cards or splash in a 3rd color if you don't need to. And if you're in a 2-color combination, you don't really need dual lands. They're nice. They're nice little additions, but you can usually get away with a deck just fine having an 8-9 split or something like that. You don't need to prioritize a dual land over a better card. If you are going to go for mana fixing, go for a card that does something a little different, like Pilgrim's Eye or Prismatic Lens, either a ramp card or a body that fixes your mana. Fixes your mana. Those are usually better odds than just taking up a dual land slot, and the 1 life is not going to make too much of a difference in the course of a game. But yeah, draft your sideboard cards. Usually, if there's nothing in a pack for you, you'll take a mana fixer in hopes that if you do need to splash a card for a bomb rare or something in a different pack, then you have the means to do so. But I think it's better to take these sideboard cards instead. Card like Relic can shut down a lot of strategies, can deal with flashback cards, reanimator strategies, so on and so forth, and it just isn't an embarrassing card on its own. Seal of Cleansing may not be the best, but there are artifacts and enchantments you will want to destroy, and having that available is very nice against certain decks, especially like Enchantress decks. And Fog, I think, I didn't play with or against it, but I think it's probably a good bet to have at least 1 Fog in your sideboard. If you use it at the right time against a very aggressive deck, it can be the equivalent of gaining 10 plus life, if you think about it that way. But these 2 go hand in hand. Draft the sideboard cards before you draft your dual lands. The exception is, of course, if you are playing a 3-color deck or you're playing a really useful splash, then the dual lands go up in value. But I don't think they're necessary for 2-color decks, and I wouldn't prioritize them very highly. Final slide here. So a couple overperformers and underperformers, and I can only really speak to the overperformers in red-white. Simply because I didn't play any of the other combinations, and I don't want to make any bold claims about cards I didn't actually play. But I'll mention just 5 that stood out to me. Coalition Honor Guard was a house. It just took down anything that was based around auras. Anytime my opponent had a pacifism effect or Faith's Feathers, or even if they wanted to play something like an Elephant Guide or some other Armadillo Cloak type card, they had to target this, and they had to find another way to get rid of it before they could do anything else. And it helps that if they cast something like Roots on this, that its ability is still active. They have to keep putting auras on it if they want to cast anything at all. It leaves your other creatures very, very safe in most situations, and it has a big enough toughness that it doesn't die to removal spells like Carbonize. Goblin Trenches, I had the pleasure of playing with this card twice, and it's absolutely absurd. I would absolutely first pick this card in almost any competitive draft. It is just ridiculous, especially in the color combination of red-white. Being able to turn your lands into 2 goblins is ridiculous, not to mention the go wide strategy really supports the card. There were times I got myself down to about 2 or 3 lands after having 6 or 7 on the battlefield just to make a bunch of goblins and swing in. Remember, Flamekin Zealot works very well with this card, and I'm surprised I got to play with it twice, but I don't know how this card worked back in the day, but it's absolutely absurd in this format, and I suggest taking it when you see it, especially in the first pack. Reckless Charge is a card that looks like it's okay, but actually really, really overperformed. It was able to account for 6 extra damage off of 1 card, which is crazy. The extra 3 damage lets you get in there very early, and then having that flashback on it just meant that whenever my opponent was available, I had basically a lightning bolt in my graveyard to hit my opponent. It was a very, very nice card to have, and I think if you're playing aggressive red or green or red-white or whatever, you absolutely want 1 or 2 of these. Sulfuric Vortex was a card that I heard a lot of speculation on. People were passing it saying that, this card used to be good, but it's not too good now. First off, it shuts off life games, so if you're racing your opponent or if your opponent's sideboard plan against your strategy is to gain life, it shuts that down. Second off, if you're in an aggressive deck, Sulfuric Vortex is going to help you win the race. You may be trading blows, but you're often going to be trading more blows than your opponent, and you're often going to be ahead on board, ahead on the damage race, and Sulfuric Vortex can really wrap things up. And then Calciderm, I can't say much else about this, but the card is busted. It's ridiculous. You can't interact with it very well because of Shroud, and the Vanish in 4 is a drawback, but it leaves it enough time to do what it needs to do. And a 4-drop, I have no idea why this card exists and why it's so ridiculous. But anyway, moving on. A couple underperformers. Duplicant. This card sucked. Maybe I shouldn't have been playing it in my red-white deck, but the card was absolutely just like bumpkus. Which leads me to believe that cards like Phyrexian Ingester are very similar. Most of the time when I got to 6 mana, if I played this, it was copying like a 1-1 or a 2-2 or something like that. Maybe it's just my matchups. I played against a lot of really low to the ground, spread out strategies, but oftentimes I was just hitting things like Curd Ape, and that's not particularly what you want to do with Duplicant. Especially not on 6 mana. It is still a 2-for-1. It's an exile creature, and you get a creature, so it's still a fine card. I was just very unimpressed with it when I played it. Roots was a little bit too expensive, and similar cards, Faith's Feather and Pacifism, while still being a very high picks, aren't the best cards against go-wide strategies. They just don't do enough against token strategies, and if you're taking a turn off to lock down 1 creature, you're already in a pretty bad spot. Cards like Squadron Hawk and what's the other one? Avarax. If you get them, and your deck is pretty good. If you get 3 or 4 Squadron Hawks, then hooray. But I second picked a Squadron Hawk in my second draft. Never saw another one for the entire draft. So keep in mind, people are going to take these cards high, and I would, in my honest opinion, just completely leave them alone because they don't do anything in singles. Avarax is not particularly great by itself, and Squadron Hawk is terrible as a 1-0, so I would just leave the cards alone in general instead of trying to get rewarded with them. Mana ramp cards, especially these not turn 1 or 2 mana ramp cards like Worn Powerstone, I didn't see a need to play them. Even if you were in like a green-black deck with big creatures, I would probably leave this card alone. Again, my bias is kind of coming in here because it's probably just great and I have a poor opinion of it, but I didn't see much of a need for the double mana ramp when you already have cards like Werebear and Milliken and Blight Soil Druid or things like that. I didn't think Worn Powerstone was ideal in this format, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then this freaking thing, Emperor Crocodile, every time my opponents played this, and I played against it 3 or 4 times, I was able to just kill off the other creatures around it, and then the crocodile sacked itself. I don't think I ever got attacked by an Emperor Crocodile. My inclination is that you would probably play something like Sentinel Spider instead of this. It looks great. It's fantastic if you can ramp it out a turn early, but if your opponent just firebolts your little mana dork and you're left with the crocodile, then bye-bye crocodile. You just let your opponent get a 2-for-1 for no reason. So I would err away from playing this card unless you can really swamp the board with a bunch of creatures. Anyway, that's a lot of talking. I hope this video didn't go too long, and I hope you're still with me here. But just wanted to shout out a couple of the nice picks I got over the weekend. Foil Baleful Strix and a Vampiric Tutor out of a couple packs. Not to mention a couple other cards like Sensei's Divine in top and Toxic Deluge, so on and so forth. I'm not going to list them all, but nice little pickups that didn't fit in my decks at all, but sweet cards. Anyway, I hope you guys got to get out and play Eternal Masters. I hope you guys made your value back, and I hope if you're opening a box that you actually get a box worth opening. There is a lot of value in this set, but there's also a lot of fun to just draft in it. I really, really enjoyed drafting this set, and even though I didn't get the widest array of what there is to play, I played the same deck 3 times, I still really enjoyed it. I thought it was challenging, I thought it was pretty deep in the colors, and I enjoyed every match I played, so hope you get the same experience. At any rate, thank you guys for watching, thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to watch the video, and I will see you guys soon for more videos. Thanks, and have a good day.